Application compatibility. In this nugget, we'll be talking about application compatibility. We'll start off by talking about some operating system enhancements that are really good enhancements, but that do affect application compatibility for us. We'll also talk about some of the new security improvements in Vista, which again are really great improvements, but could also adversely affect your application compatibility. Now, once you run into some compatibility issues, I'm going to show you several compatibility tools that can help you to analyze and resolve the issues, and also some compatibility alternatives. If you just cannot get your applications to run within Windows Vista, some other alternatives that might work out well for you. Now, as we get started here, we're going to be addressing the exam objective that says perform post-installation tasks. And a lot of things come to my mind when I think about post-installation tasks. But in Microsoft's thinking, what they're really relating to here is applications that may or may not run after you install Windows Vista. So that's really a big part of what this focuses on, and in fact, I think they should probably just rename that one objective to evaluating application compatibility in Vista, or something like that, because that's really where most of their focus is. There are some other minor things that are also focused on there, but I'll be covering those anyway in other videos. But first, I want to address the operating system enhancements in Windows Vista that can affect your application compatibility. One of those things is the Windows version. Now, we've had that for a long time. With every succeeding version of Windows, it runs into problems with some older applications that are looking for an older or previous version of Windows, and yet it's running under a new version of Windows, and so the application will not run because it says, hey, you're not Windows 98, so I'm not going to run on your operating system. And of course, there are fixes for that, and we've had that in previous versions of Windows as well, where it'll intercept a call to the operating system when it does a version check, and it will say, instead of telling the truth, saying I'm Windows Vista, it can send back a message saying I'm actually Windows XP Service Pack 2. So it does send back what we call a version lie. And there's been a number of ways to be able to send that lie back in the past. We have some easy ways of doing that here in Windows Vista as well. And I'll look at that a little bit more in the future here. Also, we have new APIs, or application programming interfaces. Now, for many applications, they're very flexible and can work with a variety of APIs from Microsoft, or it doesn't really matter what operating system a specific API might be associated with. But certain other kinds of applications are very specific to an operating system, especially things like firewall, anti-spyware, antivirus, or disk utility types of software, like a defragmenter, for example. They really work deeply inside the operating system and normally have to have an API that is specific to that OS. So if you're working with an antivirus utility, for example, that was designed for Windows XP, and you're trying to use it on Windows Vista, probably not going to work, and some of those types of utilities can even blue screen you. So the main fix there is normally going to be you have to wait for the vendor to come out with the new version of the new version of the application for the current operating system. We also have some Windows Vista 64-bit issues as well. Just about any computer being sold right now is going to have a 64-bit processor capable of running Windows Vista 64-bit edition. The advantage of that would be that it could run, at least theoretically, about twice as fast for core operating system functions. Now, of course, it's not going to be able to take full advantage of that 64-bit processor path until we also have 64-bit applications that go along with it, and of which there are very few right now. But at least the core operating system would be able to run, conceivably at least, twice as fast in terms of the processing power as a 32-bit version of Windows Vista. And by the way, that's also one of my peeves, because very rarely do you find new systems installed with Windows Vista 64-bit edition, even though they have a 64-bit processors. But regardless, 64-bit is the way of the future for servers especially, but also client operating systems, and so that's where that's headed. Now, because of the 64-bit operating system, if you do install that on your systems, and I don't have it installed on the machine we're looking at right now, but I do on every other Vista machine that I'm working with in my business. In that case, with 64-bit, you cannot have 32-bit drivers. This gets to be a real big issue at times, and it's caused some of my systems to crash and burn, or to give them limited functionality. For example, now I've got 64-bit drivers from my printer manufacturer, but prior to this, about a year ago, I didn't have one. So I'd always have to go to a different computer to do my print jobs because I didn't have 64-bit print drivers for my Windows Vista 64-bit installations. For 64-bit installations, of course, you have to have 64-bit drivers. And then there's also those older 16-bit applications. You cannot use those in Windows Vista 64-bit edition. The Windows Vista 32-bit edition has some tricks that it can use internally and things to kind of allow 16-bit applications to work, and it does something that we call thunking, or T-H-U-N-K, a thunk, in order to be able to kind of dumb it down to a 16-bit processor, or rather a 16-bit kind of a function that it would expect to be able to operate under. But the 64-bit edition of Windows Vista does not make any allowance or any concession to these older types of technologies here, and especially this one right here. So, if you got 16-bit applications that are mission critical in your environment, you cannot run 64-bit versions of Windows Vista. Also, with 64-bit versions of Windows Vista, there's no registry or file virtualization. Now, I'll talk more about that later, in fact, in the upcoming whiteboard here. But this is simply a way for the operating system to trick an application into writing to alternative locations for registry and file writes. There are also several security improvements that relate to application compatibility and that could potentially interfere with the proper operation of your apps. One of those things is something that we have very often seen, and in fact we've already seen it in our videos because I've had to work with it many times as I've demonstrated things. And that is something called User Account Control, or UAC. And I think I've explained that as we've gone along, but the basic idea with that is that when administrators log on, and I'm logged on right now as a trainer account, and if we go to a command prompt here, we'll see that if I do a who am I all, that it indicates that I'm a member of a lot of administrative functions. So for example, there's the domain admin security group, but the main thing here is I'm a member of the built-in administrators security group. So in this case, I have pretty much full access to this entire machine. Okay. However, nevertheless, when I am logged on and just operating in a normal function, and I'm using my little whiteboard here, I'm typing in a word processor, or whatever else it is that I'm doing, I'm actually using something called a split token. And the part of the token that I'm using there is just a generic user token. That does not give me any specific access, any special privileges of any kind, and that would help then to mitigate the potential damage that a virus could do while it's using my identity, or spyware or other malware can also do while it's using my identity. And it prevents applications such as keystroke loggers, viruses, Trojans, and other things like that from installing without my consent and without using my elevated privilege. Now, if I do need to use something with elevated privilege, like using computer management, for example, I usually do that by right-clicking my computer and choosing Manage. But when I do that, you'll see that it then also pops up this item here saying that it needs my permission to continue. This is a user account control dialog box, and this is the most common one that we'll see, although you may see others as well, depending on whether or not an application you're trying to run is signed or not signed, or whether you're trying to launch something that was originally retrieved from the internet, because they're considered to be less safe. And if that's the case, you have to choose to allow it to be able to run, because it kind of has to break it out of a protected sandbox in order to be able to do its thing there. We'll talk more about that as we address Internet Explorer at a later point in time in a different nugget. But for our purposes here, if I'm not quite sure what this is, I can also click Details. It doesn't really give you a very user-friendly method of showing you what it's trying to run there by showing you the executable, but that's what it is right up here, the Computer Management Snap-in Launcher. Okay, so if something like this pops up immediately and it's not something that you just now triggered, then it could be that spyware is trying to install or some other malware is trying to install under your credentials, and of course then you'd click on Cancel, but I would click on Continue for my purposes because I really might want to get to this computer management item. So that's just an example of user account control. And as far as the application compatibility issue goes with UAC, it could be that there are certain applications that are just hard-coded to be written so that only an administrator can run them. And this is very often the case with older applications, especially those that might have been written for Windows 95, Windows 98, or something like that. And if that's the case, even with user account control, remember, most of your users don't log on as administrators, they're just generic users. So then they'll see the user account control prompt appear asking them for a username and password. Well, guess what? Now, they don't have it. and you're not going to give it to them either. So that's going to put you in a tough spot, and you may have a compatibility issue to address there with user account control. There's also file and registry virtualization. This again is a great security improvement, just like user account control is. This virtualization is also an awesome idea. I really like this quite a lot. What happens with this is when an application tries to write to a protected area of the file system or of the registry, it gets redirected. You see, in the past, a lot of applications, and that might not be malicious, it might just be poorly written software that's really annoying or something and that crashes the system a lot. Well, it might do that because it writes to the registry in the HKey local machine key. Well, normally we don't really want it to be able to do that for safety purposes as well as for security purposes, because it could also be malicious software that tries to write to HKey local machine that could do some damage to your computer, because that's a pretty protected part of the registry. Well, what happens now is when you have an application that attempts to write to HKey local machine somewhere, what happens instead is that it will redirect to HKey users, and then whatever the SID is of the currently logged on user, and that's the SID of my trainer account right here. So that's my particular identity. And then it redirects us to whatever that SID is plus software classes, and then virtual store. And then what we'll do is it'll create additional keys underneath here. And this, notice that we have a key called machine. See, now those applications that try to write to HKey local machine are redirected to this location, and they can't tell the difference. They think that they really are in HKey local machine software, and then whatever else is in that. And it might be Adobe application of some kind, or you get the idea there. So these applications think they're an HKey local machine. They're really within this profile, or rather within this particular portion of the user's portion of the registry keys. Now, another advantage to that, by the way, is let's say that this was really malicious software or software that could do some damage. Well, fortunately, it's really limited to only this one user. It could still do some damage overall, but it's going to at least limit the scope because it's limited to this one user's portion of the registry key. And again, this is also part of the ntuser.dat file that's included as part of the user's profile. And then again, with file writes, what happens is, rather than going to some place like the Windows directory or Windows System 32 or other protected locations like that, or another one is going to be the program files directory. Well, those are all pretty sensitive, and we don't really want malicious or careless applications or careless files being written to those locations, because it could compromise security as well as system integrity. So now what happens instead with this virtualization is it will take any attempted writes to, let's say, program files, for example, and it will redirect it to a local app data virtual store. And let me show you what that would look like. If I just change directories, I can change to this variable. I'll go to % local app data. You don't need to memorize this for the exam, but it's just useful information. % and then virtual store, like that. Then you can see that anytime that it's going to try to write to program files, in reality, it's just going to go to this location within my own profile here, my own local user profile. It's going to go to app data local virtual store, and then if I do a dir, guess what? There's program files, and there's Windows. If I change to program files, then we'll see that if I do a dir again, that we've got several applications in here that are working within that directory. So each one of these applications think that they're actually working within /program files. In reality, they're confined to my own profile, and they've been redirected there for safety and security. And I didn't really quite complete all of this in our previous video, but I did want to show you something. Remember when we looked at our user's profile? It wasn't a part of our direct discussion, so I didn't address it in every way. But when we go into a profile like this one right here, remember that for Windows Vista, we just have things like documents. And there it is right there. We don't have My Documents. Remember that we saw this shortcut-looking thing here? That if I try to double-click on it, it just gives me access denied. Well, I mentioned that those are there for compatibility and backwards compatibility purposes, and that is true. But what these are is, even though they look like shortcuts, they're really not quite that. So if I do a change directory again here, I'll show you what they are. I'll change directory to, where am I trying to go here? See, % user profile, %. And then if I do a dir here, I don't really see any of those other things because I don't see the my documents. I don't see any of the other things, print hood, any of these other shortcut kind of things, send to, any of that stuff doesn't appear. But if I do a dir space /A, now I'm starting to see some more. Do you see the key word right there? Yeah, junction. Those are junction points, which are ways of redirecting people. Now, redirecting the applications, at least in this case. Let's go back up here to My Documents, which would be the most obvious one. See, when we have an application that maybe it's hard-coded to write to My Documents, well, we don't have that anymore, right? So what it'll do is, because of this junction point, it'll say, hey, anybody that's trying to write to My Documents, behind the scenes, while they're not looking, we're going to redirect them to C:\users trainer.nugalab documents. So it's really going to put them into my Windows Vista version of Documents instead of my Windows 2000 and XP version of Documents. We also have another thing here called Windows Resource Protection. Now, just as a brief note, some documentation I've seen from Microsoft kind of erroneously associates or equivocates file and registry virtualization with WRP. It might say file or registry virtualization and then in parentheses out to the side, WRP. That's incorrect. These are two totally different things, and I'm not sure why they even tried to put those two together. But what is WRP, or Windows Resource Protection? Well, this is the successor to the Windows XP and 2000 version of this same thing called Windows File Protection in those other operating systems. And initially what it is really tight access control lists on key operating system components, such as system files and folders, registry keys, and things like this. And what it does is it helps to prevent those critical system files and registry locations from being accidentally tampered with or maliciously tampered with, or critical system files from being deleted and causing the system to become inoperable, for example. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of that, for example. Let's go ahead and see where this goes on. In Windows 2000 XP, under the Windows directory, and System32, there was a folder called the DLL cache. And that was a backup copy of all the critical system files that you would have. And if one of the critical system files that you had gotten deleted or something, then it would automatically replace itself out of that cache. In Windows Vista, we have the Windows directory here. And then down here somewhere, we've got a Win side by side. There it is. Win SXS, or that's kind of side by side is what that's supposed to represent. And then a backup folder here. And then within all of these manifest files, there's instructions and data on how to recover a lot of our critical system files that might have become deleted otherwise. There's other things that go on here in terms of the ACL and things that will allow only the trusted installer identity to be able to make any changes to critical system files. Let me change my view here to make this a little easier to see. And let's get an example here, like security. Security.dll. Oh, I'm in the wrong directory. I've got to go on more. So I've got to go down to System32 and change my view again so we can see it better. And what I'm looking for here is just one file that I just happen to know was a critical system file, and you would imagine that it would be security.dll. Watch what happens if I try to delete this. I'll even try to delete it permanently. I'll hold down Shift, click on Delete. Do you want to do this? Oh, looks like I could just click Continue, and it'll allow me to delete this critical Microsoft system file for the operating system. So I click Continue. Okay, then I click Continue again. Then I try again. Try again. Try again. Try again. Try again. It's like a record is skipping here, because no matter how many times I try again here, it's not going to let that happen. Why? Because of Windows Resource Protection, which very tightly controls these things. Even though I'm an administrator, even though I passed the test for my user account control prompt, it still will not allow me to delete this. And another thing that's protected by Windows Resource Protection are driver files. So, for example, I've already gone in advance here to the INF directory, the Windows INF directory. There's this a file here like WinUSB, and we don't see the file extensions with what I've got turned on here, but it is WinUSB.inf. And if I right-click on it and choose Open, we'll see that there's under the version item here, there's a PNP lockdown equals 1 item. Whenever you see that in a driver INF file, that indicates that it's going to be protected by Windows Resource Protection, and it will not allow itself to be overwritten. Now, a lot of those files, by the way, can still be overwritten, but only by the system. And that would be things such as if you use Windows Update, for example, to update your drivers, or Windows Update to update other critical system files. But even administrators cannot replace these files otherwise. And then finally, we have Internet Explorer Protected Mode. And this relates to mandatory integrity control, which I've abbreviated off here at the end. Now, what really is that? First of all, just because you have Internet Explorer 7 does not mean you have protected mode. This only works if you're using IE 7, which is included with Vista, if you're using it with Vista. If you're using IE 7 on XP, for example, IE 7 there on XP does not have a facility to be able to run in protected mode because it depends upon operating system characteristics to be able to do that. But the function here is that it does not allow applications to run in the privilege of the logged on user. And it's very similar initially to user account control, so that we don't have renegade applications that kind of take over the machine. But beyond that, it also stuffs any malware or something like that. It stuffs them down into very low level integrity, so that's where our mandatory integrity control comes in. It stuffs them into file locations that are like a sandbox. And anything that they try to do, they might think that they're running amok in the operating system, but really they're being tricked into running into a tiny little sandbox with hardly any privilege whatsoever. And so IE7 protected mode is another security function that can really improve our security, but it can also affect applications, especially if you have older web applications or something that's not particularly designed with current versions of Windows in mind. And although I haven't said it, that's how a lot of how all of these things relate to our application compatibility. Again, for example, your file and registry virtualization. If there's an application that does not seem to be able to virtualize properly, you're going to have a problem with that compatibility. If you have an application that still continues to try to stomp on top of system DLLs or overwrite them or use deprecated DLLs or something like that no longer exist, then again, you're going to have an issue with this new security feature and your application compatibility. And again, of course, like IE7, older web applets and things might have a problem. All right, so then what do you do if you have an application that doesn't seem to be compatible with Vista? Well, we have some compatibility tools that we can run, and the first one runs by itself. It automatically launches every time it detects that there's a problem with an application and its compatibility in Vista. And this is just a prompt that you'll see, and I tried to get one to show up by running a bunch of old applications, but I guess I'm just fortunate because I don't have anything that's so in compatibility that it prompts that thing to run. But others have told me that if they have an old version of Adobe's Acrobat Professional Reader, then I think it's version 6 or something like that, then sometimes that will cause it to pop up. But what it will do then is it can offer to fix the problem the next time you run the program. It has to be something that it has some knowledge of, an application that it has some knowledge of and knows why it won't run and how to fix the problem. Or if it's going to be something that's a really critical problem and it gives you serious problems, then it can also warn you, or it can block, or you can opt to block the program to prevent it from running so that it doesn't damage the system. Now, you might not get that automatic prompting from the Compatibility Assistant, and you still need to do some compatibility fixes. Then you might need to just go into this Control Panel item, which is the Program Compatibility Wizard. And in Control Panel, you'll see that underneath Programs down here at the bottom. And then up here at the top, you'll see use an older program with this version of Windows. And then it launches the wizard that I just mentioned. And then what this does is it helps to make the application more compatible. We're going to see another way that I usually use to do this, and that's just using the Compatibility tab of an application shortcut. But you could use a wizard if you need a little bit more of a hand-holding method here, especially probably for end users. Then we click on Next, and you can choose which program you want to make this work with. And as you click on Next here, it'll enumerate all the applications that you have going on with this system. And I'm looking for one in particular. Actually, I don't have any problematic applications right now, but I'll just say that whatever this is a problem for me. This is actually a pretty cool little utility that allows me to make a connection to an ISO file, and it mounts it as if it was a CD in my DVD drive or a DVD in my DVD drive. So it's a pretty cool little utility. I like it quite a lot. But let's say I'm having problems with it. And again, I'm not, but if I were, I might have to choose one of these options here to say I want to pretend that you are a different operating system. Again, XP Service Pack 2 works for a lot of different things, but if it's something that's really written to old locations, old file system locations and so forth, then you might need to go to Windows 95 or Windows 98 mode here. Let's just say that I need to go to Windows 2000 for this purpose. Then we'll click on Next, and you can also change screen resolution issues. And it will change the screen resolution or colors or any of these other options that you see here if that application runs. And I'll explain those a little bit more as we go. You can also choose to run it as an administrator, and then you simply click on Next, and it's going to go ahead and try to run it. Now you can see it down here in the tray area. It did go ahead and run it. That's where this application runs, is down in the tray, and it's a pretty cool little app. Now you can say, did this program run properly? Then I would say yes, and then I would just click on Next, and it says, do you want to send this information to Microsoft? And what Microsoft does is it collects information like this, and if it sees that there's been several people that have sent in the same problem and the same fix, then they might talk to the vendor or come up with another fix on their own. I'll say no for the time being, and then I just click on Finish. That'd pretty much be it. Now, all that really happened there was I really just set the Compatibility tab properties, and that's the way I normally prefer to do all of this. So if I go to the actual shortcut itself and right-click on it to choose Properties, we'll see that on the Compatibility tab, this is what's actually happened. The wizard simply set this option. And if I want to, I can manually set any of these to whatever else might make sense for us. I don't really need to set it at all, so I'm going to clear it in this case. And the other ones you can see pretty well explain themselves, but I'll go down to a little bit more detail about why we would set some of these things. Some applications, especially if they're really old applications, might be designed to run underneath a specific screen resolution, and if you try to run them under a higher resolution, it just does not have the right visual appearance. You might not even be able to read what's on the screen. You can also disable visual themes. This might be something that interferes again with the graphics capability of an application, or disable the desktop composition, or disable display scaling on high DPI settings. Both of these settings as well would help to make things more compatible for the visual appearances. And then this one is one that's particularly useful. Run this program as an administrator. Now, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good unless you also log on as an administrator and you just want to see the user account control prompt every time, and then you can just click on Continue. Because if you select that option for generic users, they'll have to actually know a username and a password to enter in at the prompt. And you might wonder also what this thing down at the bottom is, Show Settings for All Users. Notice that it has a shield on it. That indicates that I do have to have user account control permission, so I'll go ahead and click on that and click on Continue. And then what would happen here is I would set this up for all users. The other option that we saw, the first initial screen that we saw, was only for my own individual user profile. But as an administrator here, I might want to configure this for anybody else that also logs on to this computer and tries to use that specific application. Now, this next thing I put on here is the Standard User Analyzer, part of the Application Compatibility Toolkit version 5.0. And what this does is it gives you a little bit more in-depth detail about what's going on with an application and why it might not be compatible with the operating system. So I'm going to show you a little bit about that. It's not part of the exam, so this is kind of bonus information. I just want to give you another tool that you can use that gives you quite a lot of in-depth information if you need to use it. Now, for Corel Painter Classic, that's what I'm going to run this through. I did have some compatibility issues with that, which I've already ironed out on my own. But one of the things that I ran into there was that with this application, unless I had this compatibility option to run with XP Service Pack 2, it would always bomb out on me. In fact, let me show you what happens. If I click on, I'll just leave this open by clicking Apply. But if I go to try to launch it now after having cleared that, it tells me that there's not enough memory. Well, this really has nothing to do with what the problem is. It has to do with it's trying to access certain parts of the operating system or file system, and it's not able to do so. But if I run it in compatibility mode for XP Service Pack 2 and click Apply, notice that now the application is going to go ahead and run properly, and we could continue on with this course. But so we see that there's an issue there. Now, the other thing we could do is maybe once the application is running, it only runs with it doesn't really run consistently well. Sometimes when I perform certain functions, it crashes or hangs on me or gives me some other kind of a problem. Well, if that's the case, I can use something else here called the application verifier, which you just need to do a search for that at Microsoft.com and download it. And there's different versions for x86 or Intel 64-bit or AMD 64-bit. But anyway, you download it and install it, and then you don't really do anything with it. You just let it sit there. And then you run the Application Compatibility Toolkit, and you'll see a shortcut there. Microsoft Application Compatibility Toolkit, Developer and Tester Tools, and you'll see here the Standard User Analyzer, which I put on a shortcut on my desktop. I really did that as a reminder to myself because I wanted to remember to show this to you. So I just double-click on that, and now I'm going to do this is I'm just going to browse for the executable for Corel Painter Classic. And here it is, and there it is. Now I've got it in the target application. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on Launch here, and we'll see that we get a user account control. That's okay. I'll let it continue. And then I'm going to get something here. An unidentified program wants to access your computer. This is something that we see that very often when something has been sandboxed. In other words, it doesn't know where it came from, so it puts it in a low integrity level unless I allow it to break out of that sandbox. So I'll click on Allow. And then we see that the application now does properly run successfully. And that's really all I care about for the time being. I'm just going to go ahead and close that. And then once I close it, it goes ahead and runs through everything that it was able to find. And this is just kind of a debugging information here. And I'm not going to exhaust all parts of this application that we're using, but I do want to show you some of the key parts of it. We'll go over to the file, for example, and the key part of it is if you go over to the right, you'll see where it says work with virtualization, and it'll say yes or no. And this identifies whether or not it has to run with elevated privileges, for example. And if I go to the registry, it might show me something there. And I really don't know how many of these things, different things will have something. We'll just take a look at the different ones, and we'll see different parts of it. Okay. But if we go back to the file item there, where we did see a message, if I double click on that, then especially if you're a programmer, then you can get a whole lot of different information out of this, or you can send this back to the vendor. And we can see some things that were going on here, for example, in the detailed information, that it only grants requested file write data to the NT Authority's system built-in administrators. So I do have to run this with elevated privileges if I want every part of this particular application to run. In my case, I can actually run it without whatever that file is. It does seem to run okay, but there's probably some feature that if I tried to access all the deeper parts of Painter Classic, I might not be able to access all of them because there's a file that I'm being prevented from being able to access. And that's what this is saying here. Access was restricted to trusted users only. Now, once I've gotten that worked out, if it thinks it knows what it takes to get this to run properly, I could go to Mitigation here and choose Apply Mitigations. And then what it's going to do here is it's going to apply the following compatibility shims. This means then that it's going to loosen the access control list or the security permissions on all of these locations and on all of these files. And what that'll do is hopefully make it more compatible for me when I run. Now, again, I'm not going to do that right now because that does weaken security, and I don't think I really need it for my particular case, but you can see where that could help to make an application more compatible at the potential expense of making it a little bit less secure as well. Now then, there are also some compatibility diagnostic policies, and by that I mean, like group policy object policies. We looked at policies a little bit in our previous video, but I'm going to go ahead and take a look here at the gpmc.msc. And that's the Group Policy Management Console that we're going to pop open here. And I'm just going to look at group policy for that. I'll just go here and I'll just create a new one. And I'll just call this one my application compat issues. Okay, for lack of a better thing to think of there. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and right-click to choose Edit, and then I'll go ahead and browse to where these are located. It's going to be underneath Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates. Then it's going to be System, Troubleshooting. I think it's down here. There it is. Troubleshooting and Diagnostics. And then App Compatibility, or Application Compatibility Diagnostics. And then once we get into that, we'll see these different items that we can configure. Now, by default, these things are already turned on. So it's not as if none of this will work unless you work with these policies somehow. So it's a little bit weird that way. But Microsoft for the 70-622 exam does want you to know where to locate these policies and what they do. So let's just briefly address what each one of these is for. So this first one, by default, will notify you of blocked drivers. This would be, for example, of incompatible drivers that you're trying to install. By default, it does notify you. And if you leave this at not configured, or if you select enabled, both of those options will continue to notify you of blocked drivers. If you choose disabled, then it will no longer notify you. Okay. The same thing would be true of this one. Detect application failures caused by deprecated Windows. Let me expand this out a little bit for you. Windows DLLs or COM objects. This would be where an application attempts to reference a DLL from a previous operating system that Microsoft no longer uses. That's probably no more true than it is today because Windows Vista was built just about from the ground up, and does not use a lot of those same files that have been used in previous versions of Windows. Likewise, this again, it will do exactly what it says right here by default. It will detect those application failures unless you choose disabled. Okay, and we'll talk again more about policies and what some of these different things do at another point in time in our video series here. Detect application failures, again, that's going to happen by default unless you again choose to disable it, and that explains itself. Detect application installers that need to be run as administrator, that pretty well explains itself as well. So that and that's going to be true of most applications, by the way. Just about anything that tries to write to program files or certain portions of the registry will need to be run as administrator because it wants to make a write to those protected areas. But again, that will always appear and prompt you unless you choose to disable it. Detect applications unable to launch installers under user account control. This again is something that's already going to be turned on unless you disable it. And what actually happens here is the Program Compatibility Assistant, or the PCA, will detect programs that do not properly launch their installers, and then it will grant administrative privileges that will allow this task to be performed the next time you try to launch that same application. So that's what that's about. That's what all these are about, and that's where they're located within the policy. So again, just so to review that, computer configuration, administrative templates, system, troubleshooting and diagnostics, and then finally, application compatibility diagnostics. Alright, so maybe you've tried just a little bit of everything to try to get your applications to work. You've done the things that I've told you about. You did this thing here where you did the standard user analyzer. You ran the compatibility tab and you checked all the boxes and you deselected a few of them and you weren't able to get that to work. You called Dr. Phil. He wasn't able to help you. Nothing seems to be able to work here. Well, what are your compatibility alternatives now if you're at the end of your rope? Well, you do still have some additional options. One of those things would be you could run virtual machines. Now, in a large enterprise where you have thousands of users trying to use that incompatible application, that might not be practical. So it's probably going to be more likely to be seen in niche locations. For example, engineering department that only a few engineers run a very specific application, for example. Well, you might be able to use virtual machines. And you've seen earlier where I've run VMware here. You can also use Microsoft's virtual PC. And you could have, I've got Vista here, but you could have another installation here that had XP or 2000 or Windows 98 or something like that on it instead. And then you just have to launch that operating system from within your host operating system, run the application, and just run it that way. So that is a bit of an issue. It does require a little bit of additional expense unless you're using Microsoft's free product, which is not as good in my opinion as VMware, but Virtual PC is free from Microsoft. The other option you could choose is to use the virtual server. This is something where you can allow multiple users to connect to a virtual server. And this is very similar to other virtual machines, but it allows those applications to run, and this virtual server product will allow quite a few connections to one virtual server to get that application running. And what happens with this is that you can just run just about any x86 based operating system within virtual server on a Windows Server 2003 machine as the host. And then your Vista clients can connect over the network to the applications hosted on that particular machine. So you can have multiple users connecting to that application, and hopefully that might help break out of your compatibility issues there as well. Another thing to think about is something called application virtualization. I really think that this is probably in the future going to be the most cost-effective way to go to a compatibility alternative if you cannot get it to work on your actual desktop. Application virtualization is being run by a lot of different companies, including Citrix and now SoftGrid as well, which was just bought by Microsoft not too long ago. So I don't really know where Microsoft is going to take this. But the idea with this is that you can run an application remotely, kind of like with your virtual server, so that you can just run it from within terminal services, for example, or a remote desktop connection. Or you could even run it from within a window so that it looks like it's actually running from your own desktop. It can have a shortcut on your start menu, and you'll launch it just the way you normally would. The user might not even know that that formerly incompatible application is not even actually installed on their physical machine. But in reality, they're just connecting over a network to a SoftGrid server of some kind. And a lot of these SoftGrid servers will probably be able to handle about 1,000 connections for one server. So they're pretty robust in that sense. Also, another advantage of this kind of thing is that it caches key application components. So if you have a laptop user that's made a soft grid application virtualization connection to the application server while they're in the office, and then they take their laptop on an airplane, guess what? In most cases, like these other cases here, if they had to make a connection over the network, well, they'd be lost. They would not have that application anymore. But soft grid and application virtualization is capable of caching key parts of that application so that they can run it even when they're disconnected. Now, the last option here would be to dual boot. Ugh. Boy, I don't know about you, but I have done many scenarios, back in the old days especially, where you single boot, dual boot, triple boot, quadruple boot, and on one partition I might have Windows 95, another one I might have 2000, another one I'd have XP, another one I'd have Linux, all different kinds of things going on, and it got to be really ugly really fast. So this is usually not the best solution. Usually better off to go with virtual machines instead of a dual boot scenario. However, if you are in a situation where you do actually have to dual boot for whatever reason, the application must be installed on physical hardware or something like that, then you might need to dual boot between the Vista, oops, I don't know why I did that, between Vista and XP. And the way you would have to do this is this. You'd have to have them both on separate partitions. I'll put sep parts, okay, P-A-R-T-S, partitions. Okay, separate partitions, and what you would do is you would install Windows XP first on the first partition, and then you would install Windows Vista second on the second partition. Now you could either boot Vista from the DVD when you install it, or you could launch the Windows Vista DVD from within Windows XP. Either one of those would work, and then you simply point Vista to the second partition, and you should be able to dual boot in that fashion. That's going to be an important exam objective, by the way, I would imagine. So I would make sure that you know about that. Again, separate partitions, install XP first on the first partition, Vista second on the second partition. In this nugget, we talked about application compatibility. And remember, somehow or another, it winds up being part of the perform post-installation tasks as part of the exam objective. And the application compatibility is a big part of that. And one of the things that we looked at here was operating system enhancements that can really be good for the operating system, but not necessarily compatible for all your applications, such as Windows 64-bit Vista, not too good with certain applications like 16-bit applications. Windows version checking might run into some problems with this as well, and some other things that we saw, as well as security improvements such as user account control, which is again a good idea but might have some compatibility issues, or file and registry virtualization. Remember, you don't get that with 64-bit versions of Windows, and certain other things that we took a look at here. Also, we took a look at some compatibility tools such as the Program Compatibility Assistant and Wizard, as well as the Compatibility tab, and we looked at all of those various settings as well. And then finally, we also took a look at some compatibility alternatives. If you cannot get your applications to run any other way within Windows Vista, you might need to go outside the box a little bit and find other methods that we looked at. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.